Chapter 5 begins a new, chapter for the newly freed Republic of Mexico. At this point, Mexico must learn to fend for herself and take on the challenges that hamper every fledgling country. Chapter 4 ended with Mexico gaining freedom from Spain after 11 years of war. Mexico is now on her own. As we embark on Chapter 5, we find California isolated and low on the proverbial totem pole. But California was made of some pretty tough stuff. Since Mexico was not able to give her much attention, she carried on and worked out her own issues. Like every new country, Mexico had to draft and approve a constitution. Mexico had only to look to its neighbors to the north for a model to follow. One of the points that the writers of the Constitution were proud of was the guarantee of equality, both political and racial, for all of its citizens. This extended even to the Indians. They were guaranteed rights that Indians in the United States did not receive. The people of Mexico, unfortunately, were overwhelmed by the demands that governing themselves brought with it. During the Spanish colonial periods, officials and governors were sent from Spain. They came with education and experience. Few of the people in Mexico had the benefit of both of these. This presented somewhat of a challenge. Their hearts were in the right place, but could they really pull it off? The new order did bring some much-needed change to California. Trading with foreigners was no longer a problem. This would be a boon to the local economies. Limited trade had done little to stimulate economic growth. Another change was a cry for the secularization of the missions. This would entail taking ownership away from the church and transferring the property and goods therein to the locals in the area. This was a huge issue since the missions had done very well and were very prosperous. There was a great deal of interest in how the property and goods belonging to the church would be returned to secular interests. Finally, during the Mexican period, there was a sharp increase in land grants. Grants were given to foreigners who were willing to become Mexican citizens and convert to Roman Catholicism. Because California was not a state, it could not hold elections. Governors were appointed or sent in from Mexico. Laws were enforced by a body called La Diputación. This was a group of folk who met at the convenience of the governor. There was no real legal infrastructure such as courts and law enforcement organizations. This rendered any serious work that the Diputación did pointless, since there was no real way to enforce laws. Governorship was interesting. It was one of those offices with very undefined parameters. The office had lots of power over the citizenry and the military. The governor also had great judicial and legislative power. The real kicker was that the rest of Mexico was far away and there was no one around to keep an eye. Fortunately, with no real means to enforce laws or effect any changes, the governors were really not able to do much. The norm was for things to be pretty much out of control. Power changed hands several times and governors and missionaries slowly lost control. The ranchero families began to be more influential. The ranchero families also had their share of power shift. These shifts of power tended to be more peaceful since many of the families were closely related. What was their interest in gaining power? Most of the need to wield power and influence revolved around the issue of secularization. Many of the ranchero families coveted the property, workers, and goods held by the missions. There also seemed to be a good measure of down and dirty envy as well. The struggle to retain power and influence caused a sharp division between the sureños and the norteños. Not the same norteños and sureños you find out in the hood, but rather people who lived in the north part of California and in the south. Governors came and would leave in short order due to their inability to control them. Let's get back to secularization for a bit. This was the big issue of the day. It was the topic of conversations in the cantinas as well as every local gathering or event. Greed was a major factor here. All of the ranchero families had a vested interest. There had been an attempt in 1749 to secularize. The idea was abandoned due to the lack of clergy to run the churches. Now, with Mexico being free from Spain, a new concern raised its head. Most of the missionaries were what the locals would refer to as gachupines. In other words, they were born in Spain. Those who were locally born or not of pure Spanish ancestry were referred to as criollos. The gachupines tended to look down their noses at them. Now that they no longer had the protection of the Spanish crown, the gachupines were worried that the criollos would become hostile. You might recall that the plan for the missions was that the padres would stay for 10 years. During those 10 years, they would train the Indians to run the operation, and then they would move further north and start a new mission. This never really happened. The padres never truly believed that the Indians could take over. In the meantime, the Indians were creating their own set of problems. Within the missions, there were assorted revolts, and outside the missions, the Indians were driven by need to raid mission-owned herds and lands. Meanwhile, back at the capital, California saw a quick succession of governors. The first of these was José María Echeandía. Secularization was high on his list of priorities, but there were some challenges he had to face. The love-hate relationship between the presidios and the mission was one that needed to be supported. The church needed the military and the military needed the church. If the missions were secularized, it would jeopardize the military's ability to supply itself. The church was also bringing in quite a bit of revenue via the exportation of cowhides and tallow. The duties that were levied were a major source of revenue for the local government. Echeandía had other issues that hampered his ability to be successful. Apparently, he was rather sickly and needed to avoid the dampness of the north. 1829 saw a minor revolt in Monterrey that caused Echeandía to throw in the towel. One down, who's next? Next in the long line of illustrious governors was Manuel Victoria. He was brought on by the new government in Mexico that was pro-clerical. It is important to note that in the change of power that preceded Victoria's appointment, José María Padres had been named governor by the exiting regime. Before Victoria could take power, Padres pushed Echeandía to issue an order for secularization of the mission. This was stymied by Victoria in 1831 when he arrived to take office. He took the additional measures to retain control of the locals, including the banishment and arrest of some prominent citizens. This did not go well. A subsequent insurrection led by José Antonio Carrillo and Echeandía led to some bloodshed and Victoria's removal. Two down. Because Victoria was backed by a pro-clerical government, his removal would mean the end of the mission system. The Mexican government saw secularization as a means to bring the rebellious Californios under control. In came José Figueroa in 1833. He was seen as the best official the Mexican government had sent. The problem was that there were too many issues that needed to be dealt with, and conditions were not conducive to success. He had his work cut out for him. All the while, back in Mexico, a secularization policy was adopted that was pretty sketchy. It contained a little detail about how the secularization was to be carried out. Our old friend José María Padres was apparently behind the plan. The plan called for the missions to be colonized by families that would be brought in by Padres and his cronies. He and his friends would assume control of the mission's holdings. His friend José María Híjar would become governor of the territory, and they would live comfortably ever after. As colonists actually began to arrive, a big stink began to brew. Figueroa had already begun to dispose of the mission's holdings. He was working with Californians. The locals, of course, were a bit miffed to see Padres bringing in colonizers from outside. It might have gotten ugly if a sudden shift in power hadn't taken place in Mexico, giving Padres and his associates, colonizers and all, the boot. Figueroa's plan for secularization was a good one. It protected the interests of the Indians. They received half of the lands and they were required to hang on to it. It really didn't work for them, however. They were not very clear about how the laws worked and wound up losing their lands in one way or another. Knowing that secularization was coming, the padres liquidated everything they could get a hold of. There was no secular parish priest to take over the churches. Many of them stayed, and many of the Indians stayed with them. Some Indians went out to find work as vaqueros in the ranchos or find homes with nearby tribes. After Figueroa died in 1835, there were several more governors that came and went. Mariano Chico apparently was the straw that broke the camel's back. At this point, the disorder and chaos was pretty bad. Juan Bautista Alvarado took it upon himself to take the bull by the horns. He descended on Monterrey with 30 armed men and kicked out the Mexican officials. On November 7th of 1836, California was declared a free and sovereign state, at least until Mexico could get its act together. Alvarado took reins of the government. Unfortunately, kicking out the Mexican officials didn't fix all of the problems that needed to be dealt with. He dealt with the Sureños by letting them have their own governor of sorts. He became the legal governor in 1837 and held the office for 5 years. Unfortunately, the process of secularization began to crumble. Greed and incompetence brought chaos, and Alvarado handed the gubernatorial torch to Manuel Micheltorena. Micheltorena's tenure was short-lived. A skirmish with unpaid soldiers out trying to supply themselves sent him packing. Micheltorena was succeeded by Pio Pico. He had little control and was forced to cede considerable power to José Castro, a local military official that was held in high regard by the locals. California was a mess. It was at this point that the ranchero families enjoyed their greatest influence and power. The demise of the mission system slowed the development of irrigated agriculture. Hides and tallow were a major commodity needed for a variety of other products. The rancheros became wealthy and powerful with no other industry to rival them. Rancheros became more abundant during the Mexican period, with 500 land grants given to various families after secularization. Most of the land and laborers from the missions went to the rancheros. Mexican colonizers could receive up to 50,000 acres at a time, with some individual families receiving several grants. There were some problems that would come back to bite them later. The process of granting and receiving land was not always very well controlled. Boundaries for land grants were often fuzzy. Measurement of property was not very accurate, and records were not always kept. Most grants were confined to areas along the coast. This facilitated the trade of hides and tallow. Later, the lack of available arable land would become a huge issue. The Indians continued to be exploited, often working for room, board, and little else. In the process, the rancheros became lazy and indulgent. They spent their time displaying their wealth at lavish parties and fiestas and showing off at rodeos. Even though they were wealthy, they weren't too bright. There was little value placed on education, as evidenced by the scarcity of schools in the province. Literacy was embarrassingly low.